everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by my friends over at a company called Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com. Sky Chilton and his father, Jeff Chilton. I interviewed Jeff a number of episodes ago. Really interesting guys. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. And it's a company that sells and distributes medicinal mushrooms in powder or capsule form. I was really happy to have these guys come on. I think they were very much in alignment with the values of the podcast. As you all know, a big part of this podcast is about plant medicine, holistic medicine, and I think the benefits of medicinal mushrooms are truly fantastic, and I think there's really a growing body of work that's really showing and alluding to all of the amazing properties that mushrooms have. They sell a lot of different mushrooms, things you've probably heard of, like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. Those are all mushrooms I work with. They're part of what I consider for myself a really holistic supplement regime. And the thing I really love about their company, not only are they really good guys, I think they're really ethical guys, but the product is really amazing. It's all 100% mushrooms. They're organic, and that's really rare. For better or for worse, the supplement industry is highly unregulated, and so often when you get supplements, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You may be getting some mushroom, you may be getting a bunch of fillers and other things. Oftentimes, even when you're buying what may be a mushroom, it may not have any of that mushroom in it at all, unfortunately. Even some of the big, I think even the biggest company that sells mushrooms, actually it's not the fruiting body, not the mushroom itself. It's the mycelial, which is grown on grain, and then those things are mixed up and then sold in a supplement form. So not only are you not getting the mushroom itself, you're getting the mycelium mixed with grain. So it's one of the amazing things of Real Mushrooms is it's exactly that. It's real mushrooms. So it's 100% mushrooms, organic. So you're getting a really good product. You're getting the actual fruiting body, the mushroom itself, 100% of that. And again, just really great guys. I'm really happy to have them on and supporting this podcast. So if you'd like a really good product, you'd like to start working with medicinal mushrooms, check out their site, realmushrooms.com. And also listeners of this show, if you go to their site, realmushrooms.com/universe, you get 25% off your first order, which is a really good deal. And I think once you start working and tasting their products, you'll really see and feel a big difference. So thank you to them. And I think that's it. And without further ado, here is the intro to the show. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Jasper Degenaars. Jasper's a fascinating guy. He was introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours, Jeff Chilton, who I interviewed in one of the earlier episodes of this podcast. He spoke really highly of Jasper, so it was really a pleasure for me to connect with Jasper. This was actually round two. We tried doing it, I believe, last week, and we had some technical difficulties, so I was really happy he was able to come on. Jasper is a mycologist, and we got into some really interesting topics. We talked all about mycology, about mushrooms, about lichens even, a lot of different aspects of mushrooms, their cultivation, their medicinal use, and a lot about their sacramental use, and also kind of the sacramental use of mushrooms throughout history, in different cultures around the world, in different indigenous cultures, from Mexico to the Amazon to European traditions like the Celts and the Greeks and even the Egyptians, Vedic philosophy. So it was a really fascinating conversation. I think would have been over 2 hours, and we covered a lot of topics. I think we went into some really interesting topics. So I think and hope you'll really enjoy this interview. And I think Jasper, he's a really good speaker and a really good kind of spokesperson of mushrooms in general. So As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good option. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to the people supporting via Patreon, to the patrons, thank you very much for your support. I really appreciate it. And if you're able to do that, thank you in advance. I like that website because it's really based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's an amazing way to give back. And if you're not, as always, just helping with some of the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So I think that's it for the intro. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Jasper.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
So it's 9/20 today, which is International Mushroom Day. I actually don't know anything about that. What does that mean?
Well, it was an initiative that got awakened into existence through my mentor, the late great Oliver Merav, and some other people. Because you have International Cannabis Day, right? You have 420, and then you have International LSD Day. That's 419, which is Bicycle Day. That's the day that Albert Hofmann intentionally or accidentally consumed his first big dose of LSD. I think it was actually his first intentional taking, and then it was way more than he anticipated, and then he had to be taken home by his lab assistant on a bicycle because it was the middle of the Second World War, so there was no cars in Switzerland. So I think, those days are really good kind of moments to have an open discourse about these technologies, these substances. And I think, there was just not one day like that for the sacred mushroom. And they figured 9/20 is good because that's kind of when the Liberty Cap season starts in Northern Europe. And a lot of other mushroom seasons start like that, this time of year. And it has the 25, which I think is borrowed from 420. So I think it was just it's really beautiful to honor these organisms in such a way. And, it has become a thing over the last year. So it's fun that more and more people are talking about it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. So we started the conversation last time. So we're actually doing round 2 because we had some technical difficulty the last time. And you brought up an interesting topic the last time. Maybe we can get into that, and then maybe we'll get into your background. But last time you were talking about this idea of plant medicines and how, obviously, from a mycologist point of view, that's a rather limited term. You want to speak a bit briefly about that?
Yeah. So let me see what I was saying about that before. For me, it's a loaded term. I think it comes often from people that have worked in, especially the Amazon, with indigenous practitioners, and they often get back out of it and refer to psychedelics or other mind-altering substances straight up as plant medicine. And I think it came from a similar wave that the word entheogen kind of originated. So entheogen means contemplating the divine within or finding the divine within. And it was coined somewhere in the 70s or the 80s. I don't exactly know the date. But because the word psychedelic, which was the popular term for these substances, for these technologies, kind of got stigmatized. So there's a whole, there's the etymology of kind of what we're naming these substances, these technologies, that goes pretty far. I think at first they were something called along the lines of psychosis inducing substances. And then they stepped away from that because they kind of figured out that was not what was happening. And they landed on psychedelic. And that's a really beautiful word because it means mind manifesting. And that's I think that's pretty great. You know, you manifest your own mind through these technologies and, of course, so much more. So that became stigmatized, and they started using the word entheogen. And of course, that also became to an extent stigmatized. And I think in this, some people refer to it as the third wave of psychedelics, sacred medicines. A lot of people, especially mm, in the what some people refer to as the new age scene, have just been using the blanket term plant medicine. And I think that's just kind of short-sighted, not because plant medicines aren't amazing. There's amazing plant medicines. I work with plant medicines, lots of herbs, and plants are incredible by their own like nature. But people talk especially people that I encounter that mainly work with the sacred mushroom, psilocybe mushrooms, and they refer to it as plant medicine, and they're just incorrect. Or that people that work with bufo, like the toad, or with gumbo, and they also refer to it as plant medicine, and it's just incorrect, right? I think it just kind of is almost used as a sort of, I don't know, a lingo to be like, oh, I don't abuse these substances. I do this in a mindful way, but I think it kind of got out of control, and I think like there's better ways to name them. Some of the examples would be earth medicines, sacred earth medicines. I like earth medicines. If you want to continue in the same lingo and be more inclusive of other organisms that are not plants.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I mean that term plant medicine is something that hasn't always sat exactly correctly with me, but I think I've just been too lazy to come up with another terminology for it. There's a couple interesting things that I was thinking of when you were speaking. I mean, one, I also like that term psychedelic because for me, a big part of what a lot of these, again, for lack of a better word, plant medicines are working with it is very much the mind. You know, even from a lot of spiritual traditions, they would say everything is mind, like the mind is Maya, and it's really beginning to take us into that. I think also, though, one of the interesting things that I discovered also with that term psyche is because I think in the Western culture, we look at psyche and we translate it as mind because we also are very much a mind, I think, focused society, which isn't inherently good or bad. You know, in kind of a lot of these indigenous traditions, they speak that all directions of the earth have their medicine, and the medicine of kind of the north or the west, depending on how you look at it. We are a mind-based society, which has its positive and its negative. But also for the Greeks, psyche didn't mean just mind. It actually meant body, mind, spirit, which I think is something that is often overlooked when we're even speaking about like psychiatry, for example. Like it's not just about the mind, that there was actually initially a spirit idea behind that term. The other thing that came...
pointing that out, because some translations even say the soul, that the psyche refers to as the soul. So even something beyond the bodily functions and physical realm.
Yeah. And then also the term earth medicine I like. I mean, I don't like plant medicine, I guess for two reasons. One, which you pointed out, which it does exclude, obviously, animal medicines or fungi. And even, you know, I spent a long time in the Amazon, and even in the Amazon, they do call certain plants plant medicine, but they also have a term for animal medicines, and animal medicines are medicines that they work with, and they don't refer to them as plant medicines. They would say it's a very different type of energy. And then also the term medicine, it's you know, kind of complicated too, because I think also in the way that we tend to look at a lot of these plant medicines is very much in a medical model. It's very much based on our kind of Western medical model, which is that these things are simply getting to the symptomatic cause of an illness. And I think in these more indigenous philosophies, they're not spoken about in medicines in that sense. Like those are more byproducts of what the plants can do. But at a deeper level, like, for example, in the Shipibo people, what they refer to ayahuasca, for example, because that's a kind of a pan kind of language terminology, a Quechua term, but the Shipibo term for ayahuasca is uni, and uni, if
Mm.
you translate it, it means something more like knowledge, which the word shaman, for example, also means like knowledge. It's one who knows, and you see that in kind of native traditions all over the world. Usually, these plants or someone who works with a plant like that is seen as someone who has knowledge, someone who has wisdom. The other thing that I was thinking though with the term earth medicine is I like that also, but also with that, the one thing that I see that's maybe limiting with that term is because of that idea of this kind of like, as we were talking about, like the body mind spirit connection is even in this kind of Western model, they view most illness as something originating in the body. So it's more of this idea of the physical aspect, and it's not taking into account so much like the spirit aspect or the soul aspect. And often when you talk about these plants, people will often refer to them some way as like spirit medicine or plant spirit medicine, because it's also seen that the body of the plant has a use. It can also work kind of in an idea of like correlating to the body of a human. There's a physical aspect of it. But in a lot of these indigenous traditions, they would say actually the spirit of the plant is not of this earth. It's of the
Mm.
stars. It's of an even different dimensionality. So I think then the only thing that comes with the term earth-based medicine is it's maybe not pointing to a deeper picture, which is that in a lot of these kind of traditional cosmovisions, they're actually saying that the spirit of this plant is even beyond the earth. It's something even higher than that. So, but again,
Mm.
I totally understand what you say. Because words also have real power, and there's a way of speaking at things, and I think so many of these things, it's such a new thing for a lot of people, and even in our societies, although it's not, that's the other thing that they'll probably will get into. I mean, these things have permeated our cultures since probably the dawn of time, but we've forgotten that, and so I think we're all kind of in some process of trying to find the best way to speak of it.
Yeah, well, beautifully said. I think there's a lot to get into. Let me wind back a little bit with this idea
Mm-hmm.
of uni and wisdom, and the one that knows, as in the etymology of the shaman. Maybe you and your listeners are familiar with Maria Sabina. She was a Mazatec sabia, and this is an interesting word, right? One who knows as well. Often when people talk about her, she'll be considered a medicine woman or like a curandera. But in some of the literature that I encountered, she was actually, and I've actually met some people that have like spent some time with their son, and they reflected this as well. Um, that she was actually not enjoying being called a curandera, like a healer, but like that's why her name was Maria Sabia, because she liked to be referred to as a Sabia, somebody that knows, right? And regarding the plants and the fungi as well, not coming from this earth, I do think that earth medicine is good because maybe the spirits are from a different reality, but like it grows from the earth, right? And also the toads and the frogs and reindeer, all the other animal medicine carriers, they also live on the earth. So although we have perhaps a connection to something extraterrestrial or like another dimension, we still, the bodies that we inhabit right now are definitely in a deep connection to the earth. Um, yeah, there's so much I can get into regarding the mushrooms, right? So the mushrooms, there's actually a recent study that showcased they did like a large genetical analysis, basically from all over, and I don't know how they do this. This is pretty hardcore science, but they look at like these gene patterns through like basically the whole kingdom of fungi. And then they try to backtrack kind of when these genes originated. So they found that the gene that is connected to producing psilocybin and psilocin and baeocystin, since we're talking about wording, maybe later we can go into why I'm not necessarily fond of the word psilocybin mushrooms, but like they produce these alkaloids. That is correct. But that this gene is now been traced back to over 65 million years ago. So this is about the same time that the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs came around the scene, right? So this is a very long time ago. And you could perhaps argue that since I do believe that fungi are very intelligent, that they saw that like, okay, now the dinosaurs have kind of been wiped from all of their niches that they were dominating for like hundreds of millions of years, ecological niches. They might have seen that like the newts or the shrews that were coming up that perhaps had a higher potential for connecting to these alkaloids that they were producing. So maybe they foresaw that eventually a primate-like ancestor of us would come on the scene that then eventually would eat these mushrooms with those alkaloids and very Mechanian, like go and consume these on a frequent basis and perhaps have conversations with the spirit of the mushroom. And then because of those conversations, to an extent, get taught language. This is kind of the main idea of the stone ape theory now, because, okay, so there's a lot of that we can get into, right? And I don't want to get too into details, but the base idea is that the stone ape theory, there's some good videos on YouTube. I've collaborated with After School, and there's one that Paul Stamets that goes into it pretty well. You should go check that out. Just like look up stoned ape or something on YouTube to get the full gist. But our ancestors most likely, or perhaps, consumed psilocybin mushrooms containing psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin, and all these other alkaloids. And somehow, because of that, our brains grew like in rapid size in a relatively short time. Now, recently, I think it was the end of 2023, it has been showcased by one study that was done in the UK, that the stimulation of the 5-HT2A receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, which is where these psychedelics, these substances, these technologies make connection in our brain and create these mind-altering effects, had something to do with the rapid increase of our brain size. So the stimulation of the receptor that we know that psychedelics and other substances stimulate is now shown to have a correlation with like the massive increase in our brain size. So that's interesting to look at. And I think it has to do with language. But like what a lot of people that work with these organisms also to an extent have a relation with, very much like you were saying with the teachings of the Amazon, is that a lot of people feel like that they are from a different planet, from a different place. And that's a whole field of study. There's like there's a journal called Astrobiology, which is really cool if you're into that kind of stuff. But there's pretty solid evidence that one of the ways that life perhaps could have kickstarted here on Earth is because of spores traveling through outer space and landing on our planets.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things I always think about is I think it was Michael Pollan who wrote he became maybe more widely known recently because he wrote a book on psychedelics, something about opening your mind, or I forget.
How to change your mind.
How to change your mind, yeah. But before that, he became very well known because he wrote a book on basically what he referred to as plant intelligence. I mean, and he wasn't speaking about any sort of psychoactive plants, but about this idea that we often think that humans cultivate plants, but he was kind of proposing this hypothesis that potentially plants may be using humans to propagate themselves. And it's an interesting theory. But one of the things I often think about is kind of along those lines of thinking, and what you were speaking about is, we as humans have progressed to a point where, at least in recorded history, for the first time of known history, we've sent satellites out into space. And, it's interesting because we put little codes on them, kind of pictograms, almost like you would see in ancient Egypt, because we think, well, that's probably the most easy form of communication that another species could come by. But I often think that, de facto, I was reading a number of years ago, and I'm not sure if I remember the exact name, but there's this little organism called like a tardigrade or something, and it's kind of
Yeah.
like the smallest organism that we found, and it can live in these incredibly harsh environments. Like they found it in volcanic ash or in frozen waters. Like it has this ability to live in these extreme conditions where we thought life couldn't live. And I often wonder, like, just in that same manner, without even thinking, like, we as humans potentially could be propagating life in the universe because we've now sent satellites out into space, which inevitably have, who knows, maybe spores or these tardigrades or something. And we weren't even trying to do that. But potentially that is, if you're looking at things from a bigger point of view, like life propagating itself through the human being.
Yeah, I'm happy you came to those conclusions. I made a whole video lecture on this topic, also with After School. It's called Panspermia, and if you like search on YouTube with After School, it's like 20 minutes. But that's what my conclusion got to as well, that perhaps the fungi have been using us to like try to get back out into space. And there's some really solid evidence to support this claim. First of all, you mentioned tardigrades. Tardigrades are incredibly hardy. They can survive a lot of things. And certain fungi, especially lichen, are also very hardy. So there's this lichen. It's a pretty common genus. It's called Santoria. You can actually dye with this lichen as well. So like dye your clothes and fabrics and stuff like this. But this lichen, which is a symbiotic organism, which is a collaboration between a cyanobacteria, an algae, or an algae, one of the two, which is called the photobionts, the thing that photosynthesizes. Then you have the mycobionts, which is the lichen body. And then there's a yeast as well. And then there's many different endolichenic fungi and endolichenic bacteria that live within the lichen. So this lichen, Xanthoria elegans, was put into the vacuum of space by NASA. They had the lichen and fungi experiment, LIFE, and they just had all these racks and they put them outside of the International Space Station. And they just kind of like put certain species out for like a year, certain for 18 months, and kind of were afterwards checking if they survived. So the Xanthoria lichen survived for 18 months, bare naked in space. So massive amounts of radiation, freezing temperatures, boiling temperatures, no food, no oxygen. 18 months, 74% of all the specimens they put out there survived, which is just, it's astonishing, right? So now they also tested to see how much pressure this lichen could actually withstand. And I forget the exact gigapascals, which is like the measure of force that they use to measure, but it can easily survive the amount of pressure that would be caused by exiting and entering our atmosphere, right? So the idea is that with panspermia, let's say, like, there's a couple of things. There's the really far out one that like life originated in a different solar system, but some people even argue that it was originated on Mars and Venus because it was way more hospitable for life during the early stages of our solar system. And then perhaps a big asteroid would have hit Venus that had life, and then parts of the crust would have been shot outside of the orbit of Venus, would have entered Earth's orbit and landed on Earth, and therefore kind of panspermiated life. But I do think that there is even a possibility that like these spores could survive for incredible like long voyages from perhaps different solar systems, because in the year 2000, there's almost 24 years ago, they successfully germinated a spore that was found in a piece of crystal that they dated to be over 250 million years old. So this spore had been sitting in this crystal for 250 million years. No dinosaur had stepped like any step on the on Earth at that like moment. And this spore was there. It just chilled there for 250 million years. And then the scientists just added some food and water and it just continued as normal. That's just crazy to me. So all of that together makes me think panspermia, it's not that unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also fascinating just when you think I mean, even having lived in the Amazon, you become very familiar, I think, with parasites, with viruses, these things that you can't really see. Um, and you'll see like some of these parasites, they'll overtake an insect like an ant, and they'll slowly take it over, and eventually they'll use it as a host, and they'll actually kill the ant, or it will actually be alive for a certain period of time, and they'll use it almost like a vehicle, and also to
Mm-hmm.
feed itself until it is died, or it has died, and then the parasite becomes a kind of a fully thriving organism. But I think also now with kind of this more scientific inquiry into this idea of the kind of the mind body axiom, that the gut brain axiom, like we're also realizing that we aren't life in the way that we thought we were life. I mean, we're full of life. We're full of various parasites, and that actually have an effect on us. I mean, one of the in the Amazon, one of the traditional ways you learn is through this thing called a plant dieta, where you're
Mm-hmm.
dieting, you're learning from a plant, and part of that process is you cut out most things in your life, and a big part of that is food for a certain period of time, or certain foods. And I had always eaten fairly healthy from what I thought, but I still had sugar in my diet. But it was primarily from honey. I would put honey in tea or something, but I didn't think I had any relationship to sugar. I didn't think it had any power over my life. But the first time I did a dieta, and I eliminated that for a number of weeks, I mean, probably 4 days into the diet, I was pacing around my little hut, like literally craving something sweet. I mean, it was almost like a manic episode where my body was going through a withdrawal. And, I had to use every ounce of my willpower to not break the diet and go and find something sweet to fulfill that craving. But what was that craving? I mean, it was probably different bacteria or parasites in my body that were calling, that were screaming out like, "Feed me! I need this!" And that had been to some degree ruling my life. And so I just think there's we don't necessarily even realize that the power and the intelligence of things that maybe we don't see, and kind of going to that idea of spores or bacteria or parasites. There's this whole other world that we don't see, which also kind of alludes to this idea that some people would relay to this idea of spirit world, this kind of world that
Mm.
can't be seen, but that still exists.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the connection with the microorganisms and the spirit, right? Because like they're the unseen forces that control our lives. Um, yeah, I also like to play with like fasting, and I went on a pretty big stint on like gut biome and stuff like this, and I even encountered people doing fecal transplants, and also this guy that lived in an Amazonian jungle and kind of just stole like some droppings of one of the fittest like hunters of a tribe in the jungle, gave himself a fecal transplant, and he said like his whole cravings changed, and kind of what you described, right? Like a lot of our impulses to eat are not because we're hungry, but because the bacteria and perhaps parasites in our gut are hungry, and they're sending messages that then like produce ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, or they deplete the dopamine, so they want the dopamine hit. So yeah, I think well, learning about this, we see that there's a direct physiological effect of these microorganisms, but there's still so much that we don't know, right? And just like with the spirit world, there just seems to be something like beyond and ungrasping, and like you were talking about these zombie ant fungi, as people refer them to, like the fungi belonging to Oviocordyceps and Cordyceps and many other genera of like these entomopathogenic fungi that attack insects. There's a lot of them. They're almost all hyper specialists. And what you're describing is so intelligent, right? Because first of all, like the fungus needs to land on the body of this insect, but it shouldn't eat it in its entirety at the first go. It needs to have patience. because if it taps into a certain, we don't even know how this works. We don't know if it taps into the nervous system of the insect, mainly the ant, or into actually the mechanical function of its body. And then it doesn't have a body. It's a collection of single cell organisms, barely multicellular, and it takes over and effectively controls this body, and it puts it to the right place, like the most strategic place for it to then take over and release, like consume the whole body and release its spores. And there's a lot more to that. It's a really incredible thing. But how's that possible? Right? Like, we don't understand anything of that kind of intelligence. So that's that microorganismic intelligence that then perhaps could even have a direct channel to spirit. And like, I really favor Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic field theory, that I think he argues that a lot of the dark matter and dark energy could perhaps just be physical consciousness that we don't know how to measure, and that certain organisms are able to tap into that consciousness field, and that our brains are only antennas to that consciousness field, but we have this filter. And then if we perhaps take a psychedelic or go into a deep transcendental meditation or any kind of meditation, or we have a mystical experience, that filter goes away and we tap into the divine, the one, which our religions would say is God. And if anything is a God, that like the consciousness of the universe is perhaps God.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got into some pretty interesting topics. Usually when I start, I like to give the audience a little bit of background. I think already by our discussion, they can probably surmise some, but what got you interested in all of these things? I mean, what has your journey been like to get you to the place you are in life?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is that I was kind of lost as a teenager. I wasn't necessarily happy. I was like, I didn't understand society in the Netherlands, and I didn't have much of like a vision of the things I wanted to do or particularly enjoyed. And one time, like just after my 18th birthday, my friend gave me some sclerotia, psilocybe sclerotia, that people refer to as philosopher's stones or truffles. And I have what I right now refer to as a mini dose, like a dose that some people like to refer to as a museum dose, kind of a psychedelic dose that's light, you'll feel it, but you can still hold yourself together in a museum, perhaps, or some people like to call it a hiker dose. And yeah, I had a really good day. I had a lot of fun, and I found some spark. I was intrigued, right? And in that phase of my life, I was definitely interested in exploring consciousness in all of its ways and shapes and forms. So as a child of the internet to an extent, I immediately started looking up what are people saying about this? This is crazy. And I found the Arrowhead, which gave me a lot of confidence to just start experimenting by myself. And not long after, I had a really big, I bought a whole container of the sclerotia, the truffles, and I consumed them, and I had a very classic, really beautiful experience, and I cried out of happiness for the first time, and I found passion and joy, and was really, really impressed by the experience, basically, very impressed. And as many people are still doing, I see this all the time. People that just are getting familiar with these substances and they have a really good experience, they kind of become like almost salespeople. Everybody should do this. Trump should do this. Biden should do this. Like, my grandma should do this. It makes everybody better. And that's kind of the attitude I had. So I was sharing this with my friends, and I was buying them, and they were kind of expensive. And then I visited a friend who was a little bit older, and he had like a grow kit. So in the Netherlands, you can buy these psilocybin grow kits, and you just buy them, and you just you rip open a container and you just mist it, and then you have mushrooms growing. So that was really interesting, because I was like, whoa, I've seen those on the internet. That's cool. And I was also doing some quick calculations, and I was like, oh, this is a lot cheaper. And then I kind of started getting in a rabbit hole, and I started growing them under my bed. And then I found the Shroomery, which is an online forum that had all of the mushroom cultivation people on it back in the day. And I was finding out I was buying grain spawn, and then slowly started getting into mushroom cultivation. And I've never looked back since. I've been fascinated with fungi. I've not been on like the traditional academic path. I quit any studies I was doing at 21, I think, and then I bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, and which gave me a lot of opportunity to just have a lot of free time. And I was reading a lot of books. While backpacking, I found like mycelium running, and somewhere in Australia once I found radical mycology, I believe, and just started finding all of this stuff about mushrooms. And then in Southeast Asia and Australia, you can forage psilocybe mushrooms like Panaeolocyanescens and Psilocybe cubensis, amongst many others. So then I was very intrigued to forage, because I had tried foraging for liberty caps, Psilocybe simulatiata, but I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have somebody to show me. So I would just go into sheep pastures and like spend hours on the floor. Maybe found like one or two, but I never found a lot. But when I first found Psilocybe cubensis, they're pretty big, and you can find fields of them in central, like Southeast Asia and Australia. So that really just got me into fungi. And of course, I was young, I was experimental, so I was definitely experimenting with a lot of the psychedelic substances in a lot of ways, and obviously made some mistakes and made some really good choices as well. But that's kind of how it started rolling, until in the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, I rolled up at Fungi Academy, which was founded by my friend and mentor, the late great Oliver Merav. And I kind of like came there to learn, and then there was not much. I just got shown the basics of some lab stuff I hadn't done before, but then there was an opportunity for me to teach, and I was like, "Well, teaching, I don't know." And then I found out I knew a lot already, but I also didn't know. Teaching is the best practice to start knowing what you don't know, because people ask questions, and I'm like, I actually don't know, so I need to look that up. So it was I was doing that every week, so it was kind of like a really good feedback loop of like honing my teaching skills, learning more, and like finding my own like blind spots through the teaching. And that's kind of how it's snowballed into where we are today.
So, speaking about teaching, again, I know it's a huge topic, but could you maybe just give an overview? Because I think a lot of these words we throw them around without maybe completely understanding, and I'm certainly guilty of that too. But these words like mushroom, fungi, mycology, spores, mycelium,
Okay.
I think they're words people have heard of, but I'm not sure that kind of as a whole we have a really good idea of what we're speaking about.
Yeah, so I always use the analogy of a tree, because people understand the life cycle of an apple tree, right? You have a seed that comes from the fruit, which is the apple, and that seed sprouts, and eventually grows into a big apple tree. And then if everything goes right, it's blossoms. There's some like sexual exchange that happens between a different tree, hopefully, because of the bees, and then they create their own fruit and with their own seeds, right? You can kind of see that in a beautiful loop. The fungi life cycle is pretty similar, although fungi are not plants. They're way more closely related to us. If you want to have this animated, that's also on YouTube. You can look mushroom life cycle, and then you'll find one of the videos we made for that. But very basic, a spore is a microscopic seed of most fungi, and this can be like from fungi that produce mushrooms or fungi that do not produce mushrooms. Then that spore germinates into a single strand of filament, which is known as a hypha. Multiple of those are called hyphae, and they weave together to form mycelium. And that mycelium is kind of like the tree, right? It is the main body of the fungus. And then when all conditions are right, and there's other mycelium, and there has been some sexual exchange, which doesn't always have to be the case. It gets really complicated, but in general, like there's some genetic exchange that happens. And then they work together to form this beautiful mushroom fruiting body, although fruiting body is a botanical term. Technically, it's called sporum. And then in the gills, or the pores, or whatever the hymenium is, the spore-releasing structure, they build these, depending on the group, structures that release spores. And this can be pins or sacs. Those are the most common ones. And then they release more spores into the ecosystem, right? So the mushroom is only the fruit of the main body, which is often unseen, which lives in the bark of trees or like decaying trees or in the soil or perhaps even in insects. And yeah, that's kind of like the base. Fungi are heterotrophic, so they don't photosynthesize. So they're way more like us. We also have to eat dead things, right? To survive, fungi have to eat that stuff. And because they've been around for a very long time, they've become very good at eating that stuff. They are like the master alchemists of the natural world. They can break down rock with oxalic acid, and they can harvest the nitrogen and the phosphorus from the rock, and then turn that rock into soil that then creates a hospitable place for plants. And they are kind of pillars of ecosystems. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah. So when I think when most people think of mushrooms, I mean, to start, they think of, I don't know, maybe oyster mushrooms or portobello. They cook them or they put them on their salad. I think more and more people are becoming more familiar with what would maybe generically be called medicinal mushrooms, things like lion's mane, turkey tail, reishi, chaga. People are discovering maybe more the medicinal benefits of those. And then also at the same time, psychoactive mushrooms. Can you maybe kind of give an overview of those? I mean, is there any difference between them, or are they just kind of generic names that we're giving? Is there some differentiation between what's medicinal, what's psychedelic, what has nutrition?
Yeah. So first of all, you should always cook your mushrooms because they contain this polysaccharide that's called chitin, which is the same as the exoskeleton of insects is made out of. So it's really hard for us to digest. So eating raw mushrooms, unless it's certain species like the beefsteak fungus, but there's only very few exceptions. So drying them or cooking them is generally like smart. And yeah, they're completely different species. There's sometimes even like different, obviously genera, but there are also sometimes even different phyla. So for example, a morel mushroom belongs to the Ascomycetes, which is very far removed from a portobello, right? And then there's mushrooms that are more closely related to the portobello. Like there are about 100,000 different species of mushroom, and of course there's wildly different variations. Like in the animal kingdom, like a slug is part of the animal kingdom, just like a whale. Obviously, they're very different. So within the kingdom of fungi, you have as much difference. And we are often like made to believe that most fungi are poisonous, which is not the case. There's actually way more poisonous plants than poisonous mushrooms. There's about 50 or so that can actually kill you if you eat them. There's about 150 or so that can give you gastrointestinal distress. And there's like several hundred psychedelic mushrooms, right? So I'm not saying you should just eat random mushrooms because statistically you have a higher chance of having a psychedelic than a like edible mushroom. That's not the case at all. Just always know what you like working with, always 100%. But yeah, they have very different expressions, right? Some of these mushrooms, they're what we call them saprotrophs, meaning that they eat decaying matter. And then some are what we call mycorrhizae, so they form symbiotic relationships with the roots of plants. Then there's even bacteriophages, so some fungi just only eat the bacteria that live in the soil. So you have like this, like they fill up all of the niches within ecosystems. And yeah, some obviously are psychedelic or not, yeah, like the amanitas, for example, they're also psychedelic, but you can also eat them, which is a really interesting like connection. And if you ever read Dennis McKenna's The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, is a really good book. He talks about that when he was in the Amazon with Terrence to find ayahuasca, they found just cubensis mushrooms, psilocybe cubensis, and they just started eating them. They would make omelets, and they would also say that they're very delicious. So, which is funny that like it can have so many layers, but especially the Amanita muscaria, that has all the layers, because you mentioned medicinal mushrooms. Well, Amanita muscaria is great for pain. Like a lot of people that have chronic pains, you can use it topical, meaning like you can make an ointment and like rub it in if you have a sore knee or something. But you can also take it internally, and a lot of people are finding microdosing or mini dosing very beneficial for their anxiety. And a lot of people are actually getting off of benzodiazepines working with Amanita muscaria. But then you can also take a very big dose, and that's full on like can be a mystical experience. So every mushroom, like every species of animal, has its different expressions. They produce different alkaloids. Generally, within a genus, they're going to be more closely related, like the genus Psilocybe that produces the psychoactive mushrooms. But yeah, there's just like such a wide array of different mushrooms. And what we commonly like are eating right now is just the ones that are relatively easy to cultivate or that grow in a forest in large quantities. What we're using as medicine is a very, very small fraction of the mushrooms that are actually have medicinal alkaloids present. But like we're kind of in this, the shroom boom is happening, and this is also happening within science. So we're just on the like verge of discovering more and finding out more about these organisms. And like we can, and I have no doubt that we're in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a new mushroom that suddenly everybody is consuming that right now nobody's heard of it.
What is that process like of kind of discovering new mushrooms for medicinal properties? Is that something that there's kind of people actively doing that, or they're going back to traditions, or they're just kind of randomly testing things for certain alkaloids?
Yeah, so to do a HPLC is like to get like a full spectrum analysis of all of the alkaloids and isolating that. It's very time consuming and pretty expensive. So if you want to do that with all of the different mushrooms, and then you have to like, if you find an alkaloid that's not, that's new, novel to science, then you have to see in vitro if it has some kind of efficacy. So it's like, that's a very tedious process. So generally we work with ethnomycologists, so people that go out like ethnobotanists and talk to mycophilic cultures from all over the world that still have a tradition of working with certain mushrooms, and they interview a lot of people. They go out, they find the mushrooms, they show, hey, what does this mushroom do? What do you think this mushroom does? And then they take samples of that, and then they do the HPLC, the high performance liquid chromatography, and find out if some of these alkaloids might actually have an effect, like these mycophilic people, generally indigenous people, had described.
Yeah, that's an interesting term. I've never heard that, mycophilic. Kind of from what I understood, I mean, up until, I don't know, maybe whenever that was, the 60s with Gordon Wasson, who went down to Mexico and kind of, rediscovered mushrooms for the West. There was this idea that, I mean, one, in general, people were quite scared of mushrooms because they did think you would die if you ate them. I mean, I remember even growing up, I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S., and it's a very culturally diverse area. You have immigrants from all over the world. And every year I would hear that there was, every year, like kind of clockwork, it's not funny, but somehow it would happen like clockwork. There would be like a certain number of Korean people that would die from kind of foraging mushrooms. And I guess there was a particular mushroom, I can't remember now, but that looked like something that they were familiar with in Korea, but it was kind of a false mushroom that was toxic. So I think there was a lot of fear, and also this idea that it wasn't known that mushrooms were worked with in a spiritual, religious, a psychoactive way, and this was kind of like a rediscovery. So I think with that, at least in the West, that there wasn't really a knowledge that there were. What was the word again? Mycophilic cultures. So what is your understanding, or can you maybe take us back into history a bit of maybe mycophilic cultures that existed in the world, and are there still cultures in this present day that still work with mushrooms in that way?
Oh yeah, tons. So, but like Gordon Watson and mainly his wife, I think his wife she have a lot more credit. Valentina Pavlovna Guerkin, she was Russian, right? So she grew up going out in the forest with her parents and finding chanterelles and boletes and all these mushrooms because that was, they still had to. Like even like right now, the winters in that part of the world is so hard that you have to prepare for the winter. What you do is during the fall, you go out and find mushrooms and you pickle them and you preserve them so you have stuff to eat for the rest of the winter. Um, I think every indigenous peoples had those connections with those mushrooms everywhere, right? So there's a really important archaeological find. Otzi the Iceman was found in the early 90s on the border between Italy and Austria. And he was completely preserved in ice. Like he was found in his condition was basically very short away from a miracle. And so we knew a lot about his culture. Like his skin was intact, so we saw tattoos. There's even like tattoos that we argue are for perhaps treating rheumatoid arthritis on acupuncture points that we know of traditional Chinese medicine before there's any evidence of acupuncture in China, right? And he lived about 5,000 years ago, 5,500 years ago, something like this. But he also had two mushrooms on his hip. He had Fumus fumitaris, also known as the amadou or the tinder conch or the hoof fungus, which is a great fire starter, and you can use it as a mushroom, like a place to keep an ember. And he was traveling by himself, most likely. So if you have to make a fire in the fall or the winter in Europe by yourself, every night when you're traveling, that's going to be very hard. So having an ember that you can carry around for the day and then have a little starter would be very, very useful. And he also had Fomitopsis betulina, also known as the birch polypore, which has a lot of betulinic acid, which we know is very effective against treating whipworm, like an intestinal parasite. And we now know that because his guts were intact, that he was actually suffering from a whipworm infection, right? So this European man, 5,000 years ago, knew what was like ailing him within his body and knew what organism in his natural environment would give him the remedy. And that was in Europe, right? So we all have those roots. And especially if you go south, like just in Asia, people are super mycophilic. People eat lots of different mushrooms, China, Japan, Korea, all over. And the issue with Korean people come, or in the Netherlands, it's Polish people that get sick because they are familiar with the mushrooms in their ecosystem. But then they go to, especially a different continent, and then you might suddenly have a white mushroom. If you can eat all white mushrooms in Korea, and you don't have Amanita phalloides, which is the death cap, then you're in trouble. It's the same if Mayan people would come to Europe, or like even North Americans, and they would see agaricus, which are the common button mushrooms that grow in the wilds. In North America, almost all of them are edible. In Europe, they're not. You're gonna get some like stomach aches and stuff like this. So it's all about like knowing your local ecosystem. But our ancestors were obviously masters. They were like as intelligent, if not more intelligent than we are. And that's the only thing they did is eat food from their ecosystem, right? Gather food, hunt for food, maybe perhaps do some like traditional growing of food or seed spreading and this kind of stuff. So these people were obviously super in tune with anything that could be used to their benefit in their ecosystem. And fungi are just incredibly beneficial and abundant. So I think we just need to do more like research, but like what I'm very, very certain of is that any indigenous culture, and like us, like I'm Dutch, I was born and raised in the Netherlands. We also have an indigenous roots, right? It's just been wiped out by Julius Caesar when he had like this whole idea of like conquesting the Celts 2,000 years ago, that we lost our connection to our indigenous ways of living. But there's a survival of that as well, partially inspired by the people that have kept a traditional way of living up until this point. or perhaps some people that have kept some of the Druidic Celtic traditions alive. And part of it is also reinvention, which is happening, right? Just like a renaturalization, re-indigenizing, as some people are referring to, of just our own skills and practices, so we can be more in tune and in harmony with our ecosystems.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, it was probably 20 years ago now, but I was in Mongolia, and it was kind of a long story, but I was on horse, and I was looking for and had found this group of people called the Satan people, who were reindeer herders, and I spent some time with them. It was when I was very interested in shamanism and kind of the beginning of that journey, and on the way back, I had run out of food, but it kind of serendipitously, I mean, could just be coincidence, could be some divine intervention, but a number of weeks or a month or so before that, I had randomly met this Polish guy, and he was the only like foreigner who I came across, and we hung out for a few days, and he, I guess you could call him a mycologist. I mean, he was very familiar with mushrooms from his upbringing in Poland, and he was kind of showing me and teaching me about a number of the edible mushrooms that he had encountered, and I could only remember one of them for certain. But fast forward, when I was on this horse and I had run out of food, I lived for about 2 weeks off of this one particular mushroom that he showed me, and rhubarb, which I knew how to identify, and pine nuts, which existed in that, and just from those three foods, and sleeping outside every night, I've never felt better in my life. I mean, I felt energized and clean and pure, and it was an amazing experience. It was also interesting because when I lived in the Amazon, a friend of mine who I worked with, she ended up kind of creating a program where she found reishi mushroom in the Amazon, and she started making tinctures and selling them, and kind of empowering the local communities to identify, to harvest, to work with them. But they had no knowledge of mushrooms, and I always found that quite strange, because they had such a kind of wellspring of knowledge of medicinal plants, and I always kind of assumed, and I don't necessarily have any basis for that, but that somehow that knowledge was lost. And I think, like you were saying, in cultures all over the world, I mean, just knowledge of those traditional ways has been lost. One of the interesting things about this idea that you're saying, like kind of finding our indigenous nature, and there's been some interesting books written. I mean, one was a few decades ago. You're probably familiar with it, by a guy named John Allegro, and he wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. More recently, there's a book called The Immortality Key by Brian Murdurescu, I think is his name.
That's his name.
But for many people, and I think especially, Europeans or European descent people, we have been led to this idea that like we're not indigenous in a way, and yet that term, it simply means, I mean, it means to be human, to come from some certain way of being. Bigger subject, but also I think one of the kind of mind viruses of our time is that we do view ourselves as very different and other, but I think for most people, that idea, because you mentioned, like, even within Europe, there was these cultures that the Druids were kind of, again, the wisdom keepers of the Celtic people. And even in my own work, I've been really inspired by the Celtic tradition and their knowledge of plants. But like, with that idea, we usually view these things as opposing forces, like indigenous customs or knowledge of mushrooms or plants. And it's fascinating because even in the Amazon, I just interviewed a Shipibo guy recently. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that most Shipibo people, I would say now, I think that's accurate, probably most, the majority, are also Christian. And yet they don't necessarily find any conflict in that between their own indigenous practices of working with plants, of working with spirit medicine, and different Christian ideas. But I think for most of us, we view those things as completely unrelated. And it was interesting because you mentioned like it was Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire who really came and kind of ended a lot of these more indigenous European practices, because it was seen that they weren't compatible. They were seen as a threat to that kind of that control that the church had. But those books that I was mentioning, and I think it's something that's becoming maybe more prevalent in people's minds, is this idea that maybe even in Christian roots were potentially sacrament, using certain sacraments and possibly mushrooms. And it is fascinating because you do see in a lot of early Christian art, you do see symbols of mushrooms. You see it in Egyptian cultures, which some people would argue is the predecessor of Christianity. But like from your experience, what do you think in these kind of, whether it's more like Celtic traditions, indigenous European traditions, or Christian traditions, do you think, and if so, what do you think was the role of certain sacraments like mushrooms in that?
There's
Big
not
question.
so much known. It's a big question. I think the first thing is like there's very little known about, especially within Europe, because the Celts were not a literate society, right? So the argument is like, oh, the Druids weren't even aware of the Liberty Cap growing. I'd be very surprised if they weren't aware, because there's even an account in the 1700s that a family ate them by accident and then had this whole experience. It's like, you can't tell me that the people that lived on those lands for thousands of years and tried to survive through harsh winters and all that stuff didn't try this mushroom that's very, very abundantly growing, especially with the sheep that they were herding. But there's not much known or anything known about their relationship and how they were consuming this. I think, especially in our European traditions, like the root that we have is like the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Which Brian does a really good job at bringing into modern light. He was obviously very inspired by The Road to Eleusis, which, if you've not read The Road to Eleusis, it's amazing. It was written by Carl Ruck, Albert Hoffman, and Gordon Wasson. That's some big names. And they argue in this book that it was ergoth that was the secret to the Kikion, right? The sacred sacrament of this ritual, this secret, mysterious ritual that happened for over 2,000 years, that a lot of the philosophers were saying was the foundation of Greek culture and society. Every classical Greek writer, poet, philosopher that you've written probably went to the mysteries at least once. It was really, really important for the people that we now consider to be Greeks, right? And it was most likely a psychedelic ritual that then also had a theater performance, right? A ritual theater, consuming a sacrament, and having a theater play that play out the story of Demeter and Persephone and the rising of the underworld world. And allegedly, according to Brian, he speaks classical ancient Greek. I don't, but there's this. He can say it fluently. I just know the translation. But on the entrance of the temple, it would say, "If you die before you die, you don't die when you die." Right? And I think that's a really psychedelic sacrament experience that a lot of people find when they are first working with these organisms, the mystical ego death and a death of the self to be reborn and therefore have a new outlook and perhaps a metamorphosis, an alchemy that happens, and an internal change. So I do think that root doesn't just come from the Greek, right? I think that root that comes from somewhere else, because I'm also side tangent. I'm really interested in linguistics, and not a lot of people know that the language that we're speaking right now has a root to the language that people speak in India. So we're within the Indo-European language family, and that was one peoples that spoke that language. So we have this ritual sacrament that nobody knows what it is in Greek, but we also have that in India. And India, they call it soma, right? And they don't have the whole theater as we know it, perhaps they do, of Demeter and Persephone and like a big temple. But we do know that people were taking this substance, quoting Western archivist, Amanita, it's probably a psilocybe. Perhaps, like, we don't even know if the ergotized beer perhaps used in the Eleusinian Mysteries was really the case. It could also just be a psilocybe mushroom that they find and then like grind up anyhow. But like, I do think that there's a root to that tradition, right? Of having a big ritual event on, it's actually happening, excuse me, around this time. It would have happened, the equinox. This is when the greater mysteries would have happened. Really, like, that's also why 920 is on this day, because it's close to the equinox. So yeah, I think that root has traveled all over the world, like all over what we now call to as the classical world, right? From Northern Europe and Western Asia and to an extent the Mediterranean. And that's obviously the birthplace of Christianity, right? So Christianity was founded, it got its start in a place that very much had these rituals and this mystery, this tradition ingrained in its culture, right? And this is what like Brian Murarescu also does really well in his book, is connecting all of these ancient Christian traditions to Dionysian cults, Dionysius being the god of wine and fermentation, but also madness, and argued by Rook in The Road to Eleusis, the god of fermentation. And they saw the mushrooms as the earth fermenting itself. So Dionysius was also this god of mushrooms. And with Dionysius, he is also the wine. So when you are dancing with Dionysius, you're drinking the wine, which is him, right? Like, that's like almost a one-to-one copy with like the sacrament of Jesus. So you have the wine, you drink the blood, but then you have the body as well. And now you get a dry cracker. But what like also John Allegro argues, and now a lot of people are arguing, is that there's perhaps a different body that you're consuming. Perhaps a mushroom, perhaps a psilocybe mushroom. I think John Allegro thought it was Amanita muscaria as well, with all the red and white that's happening in the church at this stage, right? Like all of the attire and the dressing and the fashion that the priests are wearing. So like, these traditions must have found roots in something that was really profound. I wonder how many people get a little of that, like, I've never been in a sermon, but like a little dry piece of that cracker on their mouth, and suddenly all of the portals go open and they feel connected to God. I wonder how many of those people are having that experience. Probably less when it is not a mushroom with psychedelic alkaloids that has been put on in your mouth. So to me, those connections seem too obvious to not have some foundation.
I mean, it's fascinating because even in the Catholic Church, I think a lot of people don't realize, but when you're taking that sacrament, when you're taking the Eucharist, when you're drinking the wine, they don't view it as a metaphor. I mean, the Catholic Church says this is literally the blood and the body of Christ, that you're consuming the sacrament so that you can be one with Christ. You know, now we take it to be symbolic or metaphorical, but in its origin, it didn't say that at all. It specifically said, this is literally the blood and the body of Christ. You know, you also mentioned, and I think that's where etymology or just roots in general is very fascinating. And you mentioned soma, and because, like you said, like English is part of this Indo-European language, which means at some point there was a common root. And even in India, where they were speaking of soma, like you read the Vedas, but essentially the Vedas, which are songs that have been sung since time immemorial, they say that knowledge wasn't from them. They say that it was from an older people called the Aryans. Mm-hmm. And, that word may be kind of triggering for some people, but that's the root of the word Aryan. It wasn't, kind of Hitler's I mean, that's why he was so fascinated by it, because he believed, I mean, probably a lot of people don't realize, like, that the Third Reich was very fascinated in esoteric philosophy. I mean, many of them were vegetarian. They were
The
into the
cross, right?
occult. Yeah. But they believed that this kind of mythological ancient people, the Aryans, there was this occult power, and they were trying to rediscover it. But the idea of Aryans came from the Vedas, from modern day India, and they said that it was this, like, these people who passed down this information. And as you said, that idea of soma was this sacrament that they consumed. It's also very fascinating because in the Zoroastrian religion,
Mm-hmm.
etymologically, they don't pronounce the S, they pronounce it like an H. And the sacrament
Oh.
for Zoroaster was homa. And it's very interesting because etymologically, that's where, like the home the harmful alkaloids come from, which you find in
Mm.
things like ayahuasca, which was also called telepatine. Still in, like, modern day Afghanistan, there's a plant that contains those alkaloids that's actually linguistically still tied to that
Yeah.
word hauma.
Uh-huh.
And even in Central Asia, I know there's a Russian archaeologist or maybe ethno-archaeologist, who found these very ancient uh, sacred sites, and he found, like, kind of like Brian was describing, these sacramental containers of a beverage that contain that halma plant, I think along with maybe cannabis and opium, and he was
Mm-hmm.
kind of surmising that it was, again, some ritual drink that contained those things. um,
You know
I
what
mean,
I'm
it's
hearing? Sorry.
sorry.
You know what I'm hearing when you say that Zoroastrian pronunciation? I'm hearing Homer as well,
Mm,
because we don't even know if Homer was a real person, right? We just call him the Homerian hymns, and he is attributed to, like, those songs that have been, like, also sang, right? Like, it's the same as the Vedic traditions, songs that have been sang for time immemorial that have that connection to Homa, Soma, Homer.
yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating time also that we also have access to, like, all of this different information, and kind of these sources that we can kind of cross reference. And but like you, I mean, the more that, from my own experience, and then just from circumstantial evidence, I mean, it does seem like at the root of all of these cultures all over the world was some sort of sacramental use of something, whether it was a mushroom or a plant, or could be both, or some one, some the other. um, it's something that, as you said, and maybe from your own experience, or from mushrooms in general, I think a lot of people in this day and age feel very lost. I spent
Mm.
probably over a decade in the Amazon at a big ayahuasca center, and people come for different reasons. Sometimes physical healing, anxiety, depression, trauma, generational things. But I would say that the biggest reason people came was they felt lost. They felt like the society they were coming from wasn't giving them the answers they were looking for. And so they came halfway across the world to this culture that still was working in some way, in some system, that when they experienced that sacrament, it put them in touch with something that made them feel more whole. And in a lot of these indigenous, like, traditions, they would say that kind of the root of human suffering, when you boil it down, and it's been going on for eons, it's not like a modern phenomena that we're dealing with, is that we've forgotten who we are and where we come from.
Mm.
Um, do you do you have, like, any other, because it sounds like you're something that you're quite interested in. Do you have any, like, other stories, or your own personal experience, or things you've studied that kind of shine light on the sacramental use throughout antiquity, that certain cultures were working with these things with?
Like the shine light
Yeah, I mean,
on
like, for
their
example, like, a
use.
lot of people, like you were speaking about the Greeks, and some people will will even predate the Greeks to the Egyptians. And some people
Hmm.
say, like, in some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs or structures, you can find symbols of mushrooms or blue lotus or
Hmm.
it just seems like, because we were also speaking about India, and that's a huge part. Also speaking about that idea of ritual. I mean, you go to India today. I mean, it's full of temples. It's full of ritual. It's
Hmm.
full of recreating these stories through song, through dance. I mean, it seems to be a very fundamental part of human culture that maybe only recently we've begun to become disconnected to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fundamental, and I think that's also why people feel so enthralled by the stoned ape theory, right? Is that like we've been consuming these organisms since before we were humans, and I think it like totally makes like sense to me that like we see this with all indigenous cultures, right? If there's something that can alter their state of consciousness in whatever way, shape, or form, they're into it, right? Because, or at least somebody within a group is into it. So I think that is to an extent our nature. And I think the displacement can have something to do with not having these rituals, but I think it's also has something to do with not feeling like part of our truest self, which is part of a tribe, right? We're pack animals and we're formed like pushed into these boxes of nuclear families. And we actually thrive when we are surrounded by all of the generations, like elders. And I'm not talking about old people because that's, I think, is a different thing sometimes, but people that actually have wisdom and that are happy to share that with the people that came after them, but also to be surrounded by young ones because they have their own teachings, right? We can experience our own childhood through them, and that has like such immense value. And then also, of course, our peers, right? And being together and like sharing meals together, singing songs together, right? That's really like, yeah, the sacrament that people would take in the ayahuasca center, like that has a big impact because you're suddenly like you're going through this whole transpersonal, like etherical journey. But I think when people come to us, and we don't even like that's not our main thing serving mushrooms, but people are just so impressed with the sense of community. It's like, oh wow, we have dinner together and then we all talk together and there's no screens to distract us, and then we're in nature all the time, and we sing songs, and then we have like a little variety show and people can show up, like we have like we entertain ourselves by reading poetry and doing all those things. And I think that is such a deep a miss for a lot of people. Just like a solid group of people that like we're building life with, not just ourselves, not just our partner, our children, our parents, our direct family, but a group, a pack of people that we feel like aligned with within our values and what we care about. And I think when people come to the Amazon, they see like how like perhaps the Shipibo people live, and they feel like, oh damn, this is something. I feel a little less lost now, right? Because that's why I like ecology, because it's the study of our home. That's where like the etymology comes from, like being home. And like I think, although we have these structures that we call homes, I think on a soul level, a lot of us are looking for a home. And I don't think it's a physical place. I think it's a state of being, perhaps with other people. And I think that that also invites rites of passage, right? Because if you have like a group like that, I'm sure people have like absolutely crazy rites of passages for when women start bleeding or when boys become men, because that's part of like lifting them up, right? Now you were a kid and now you have to start carrying your weight, and we have faint like fake remnants of that with, for example, the bar mitzvahs. Like I'm not Jewish, so I've never had a bar mitzvah, or like there's even these Christian traditions, but they feel like almost like a puppet show of what it used to be. Like I bet none of those 12-year-old boys that go have a bar mitzvah feel like I'm a man now. I got to start like pulling my stuff, you know. And I think that's also why a lot of us are lost, because like, that's how I felt lost. And I like when I talk a lot to my peers, and I'm a late phase like millennial. Um, we we don't have that, so we have to make our own. And a lot of us are going into like a lot of partying and or a lot of travel to try and find some essence of like transformation and understanding what it now means to be an adult. And I think those sacraments can be a really powerful tool. And like having seen how they can be used all over the world, right? And we're still uncovering this. But like I'd be very surprised if that's not how like it would have went for certain peoples, right? Using these sacraments in a certain rite of passage. And it can be from like boyhood into manhood, but it can also be a different rite of passage, right? Like a marriage or like some other, like you get it bestowed upon a role in the group, right? And I think when you then also go into like some of the history, right, and into the stories that are happening and like the the stereotypical hero's journey, I think that's also like a metaphor for perhaps the psychedelic experience. It's also for real, right? Like you have the hero that goes out and has an adventure and learns a lot of stuff about themselves and then take it back, right? We see that like all over the world. And I do think that is inherently linked to what we through the experience within ourselves on like a psychological, esoteric, spiritual level within the psychedelic experience. That's why I'm pretty sure that Terence McKenna called the 5-gram dried mushroom experience the hero's dose, the hero's journey, because he connected that to, I'm blanking on the author of the hero with 1,000 faces, Joseph Campbell. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think all of those things are connected into what makes us human and what a lot of us are missing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. You at one point spoke about the Amanita muscaria mushroom. That's a very interesting mushroom. I think a lot of people are familiar with it. They've probably seen images of it. I grew up watching a show called The Smurfs, and I think they lived in Amanita muscaria mushrooms sometimes.
Uh-huh.
You see it in a lot of old drawings. You see it around Christmas time. Yeah, so I think this idea of Amanita, it's a mushroom that people are very familiar with simply by, because it has a very kind of particular look, a very beautiful look, I think, in many people's eyes. And it's very prevalent in a lot of our cultures. There's even theories that I'm sure you're familiar with of like kind of the Siberian people and the Santa Claus story, the Christmas story. But it's an interesting mushroom in that, you were just saying maybe more the medicinal benefits of it are being discovered. I think that's something not a lot of people are familiar with. Some people are familiar with this psychoactive ability of it, but it has this reputation that I think often the people who've worked with it, that it doesn't really give them an experience they were looking for. Do you think that knowledge of how to work with it has been lost, or there's maybe certain rituals or preparation that allow one to go deeper into that mushroom? I've even heard like in Siberia, the shamans would, because they were working with reindeer, that the reindeer would eat it and then they would drink the urine, and that somehow like allows more of the alkaloids to be present. But what's your experience or knowledge with that mushroom?
Yeah, you wrapped up a lot of the popular lingo around it, right? Like the popular stories, like the actual shamans, the people actually call themselves the shamans in Siberia, that also dress up as the Amanita mushroom, right? They wear red clothes with white dots, and like you have the reindeer, and then you have the connection to Santa Claus. And then perhaps the connection to the Christian church, why the Pope, like the priests and the bishops and all those were also wearing that red and white. I'm not called to the large experience. I think it is for some people, and I do know people that have like had big experiences that found a lot of benefit in it, right? So it's not psilocybin or psilocin or baencystin. So it's muscovol and ibotonic acid. So they're very different alkaloids, and they work on your. I'm not so familiar with the neurochemistry, but I think there's a certain gamma receptors, different kind of receptors on your brain, Anyhow, there's a really good book by Kevin Feeney. It's really thick. If you ever want the culture, like the neurochemistry, the biochemistry, the ecology, like it's the best, like all-round book for Amanita muscaria. I haven't gone to it yet. I just went through it, but like it is intriguing, right? It has those vibrant colors. It's very speaks to us. It not only speaks to us when we walk through the forest, but also speaks to us through mythology. Because if you go into European mythology, and you just find it all over, right? It's like the mushroom that like the leprechauns and the gnomes are sitting like working with, and like there's obviously the association with the spruce and the Christmas tree and like other conifers because it's mycorrhizal. It connects to the roots of these plants, so you can't cultivate it. So it only grows in these ecosystems in the forest. So there's so much to this mushroom that people must have had a relationship with it. So it's also known as the fly agaric, and this is kind of universally like similar. Like in Dutch we call it the vliegzwam. In German, it's the Fliegenpilz. Like it has some association with flies. Then in Europe, people would say that it attracts flies, but then the people I work with in the Main Highlands, they say that it repels flies. So it seems to work for both. And yeah, the consumption is not to be taken lightly. I think for a long time the mycology books lied to us, and they said it's just straight up poisonous, and it's not. Like you can, with some pretty simple paraboiling, you can actually eat it, and it's pretty delicious. And I think the big doses are, yeah, for the really daring psychonauts, you have to really know what you're doing. Mainly because it can be just very challenging. There's a lot of salivating that happens, and that's the ibotonic acid. So you're trying to get as much of the muscimol. This is why maybe also the shamans in Siberia drink the reindeer piss, because it allegedly filters out all the ibotonic acid and just leaves you with the muscimol, which is the more pleasant molecule to work with, allegedly. But we also see this idea of fearlessness, right, in the mushroom, because there's many animals that eat this mushroom, including reindeer, yeah, but also bears. Bears eat this mushroom during mating season. Mainly male bears eat this mushroom. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the berserker tradition. And now I recently heard that there's some debate if this was actually real, but the story being that the Vikings, they had a certain warrior class that would eat this mushroom before battle, and then they would like have less fear and go berserk. That's where the word berserk comes from, because of the berserkers. And so there seems to be a correlation with fear and anxiety and this mushroom. So when you consume this mushroom, there's less fear or less anxiety, and that's why I think a lot of people have a lot of benefit from this now, by consuming it and trying to get off their benzodiazepines, which are also anti-anxiety drugs. But then also the pain, right? So like if you're a bear and it's mating season and you have to fight a bunch of bear to like try to mate with a female, and you get like hurt in the one fight, you need to keep going to like successfully mate. So a lot of people find like it does reduce like local pain, either topical or when you consume it. So I think that there must be some kind of truth to it. We also know that the Zulus kind of like been working with the cousin of Amanita muscaria, the Amanita pantherina, which also has a muscimol and ibotonic acid. So, and it's sometimes believed that that's why they fought and kind of won over the British forces, which were like technologically way more advanced than the Zulus were, just because they had this fierceness and this tenacity and this fearsomeness and fearlessness. So that's kind of like the paths of research I've been going into. Obviously, it speaks to us as humans. What it is exactly, is it because it's like has a deep connection to like these alkaloids that give us these experiences, or that it's just like, you know, some beings just like really resonate with us and have, as some people might call it, a really strong spiritual energy, and can kind of be like these antennas of spiritual portals. right? That's when I think the stories of like the fairies and the gnomes come out when this mushroom is there, because it's can be some form of energetic portal that some of our ancestors that were more sensitive were able to tap into.
Yeah, amazing. So when you speak of microdosing amanita, what does that look like? Like how is that mushroom microdose? What's that process? How does one work with it in that way?
Yeah, so this is pretty new. So I highly recommend checking out like Amanita Dreamer. She's out there. She's a very interesting human being. But like, she made some good videos, and she's really like an advocate for the Amanita. And a lot of people find help in her experience, because she was just kind of, I think she was from somewhere in the south of the US, and she just like was feeling lost. And she saw an Amanita, and without doing much research, she just started eating them and started experimenting. Pretty wild. Um, so microdosing, I think, is generally done with a tincture. So tincture process, I think, is the same as any kind of mushroom. There's a hot water extraction and an alcohol extraction. And if you don't know what to do, maybe find somebody, get a tincture. They are definitely around. It's completely legal, so you can just find that. And there's certain people that like to take it in the beginning of the day, um, which if you're dealing with chronic pains and perhaps like chronic anxiety, like I would suggest um, doing it in the beginning of the day. But it also really helps you sleep very deeply. So I like to take it at night after or during dinner if I have access to nominated tincture. The down and upside is, although I sleep very deeply, I feel like I'm really well rested. The dreams go crazy, like absolutely crazy at night if you work with Amanita. So be prepared for that. So yeah, tincture, depending on the potency of the tincture, right? So like that's why I generally tend to just for the first time just buy a tincture of somebody that you can actually have a conversation with, preferably, and then like ask this person question. Okay, how strong is it? Like how many drops? Because it's or how many droppers? So generally comes in a dropper, but one full dropper is generally a dose that you can start feeling it.
So how about in general? I think that's a term that people are becoming more familiar with is microdosing. What I guess in general, how is that worked with? What do you see the benefit of microdosing versus working with a mushroom and its maybe more medicinal dose versus working with it and kind of as you described this more heroic dose?
I might be the not the best person to ask this question. Um, I think a lot of people are finding incredible benefit from microdosing, and that's super powerful. I don't know if I'm necessarily one of them, unless it's like I'm embracing going through like an emotional process. Like for me, it's kind of like too much of a curveball. And sometimes it just like takes me into a direction I wasn't fully prepared for. And especially if it's just a regular day that I want to be productive in, that might be challenging for me personally because I'm really sensitive. So yeah, I think regimens are really good. I think the best way to approach it and how I found my most benefit is just kind of make a regiment for yourself, uh, have an intention. What do you want to like see changed, right, in this protocol? And then a lot of journaling and a lot of reflection during this several week process. This can be 7 weeks. This could be like even as close as 2 weeks. If you take it one day on, one day off, or like 3 times in a week, or however, that's kind of like it's all relative to your own experience. So I do think that like there's a lot of powerful potential with people that have uh, like traumatic head injuries, like concussions. They find a lot of benefit with it. So like a physical remedy, and as a practice and as a spiritual remedy, I see a lot of application in kind of the integration process to kind of have the reminder and like start a protocol, like have a big journey, and then perhaps um, have a week like just integrating au natural, and then when you like the week after start a not microdosing regimen with a good journaling practice. I think that's the best way to get the most out of both worlds. um that's just my approach. I've always been kind of like diving deep. So I think the big journeys have been the most potent for me. But I think there's also a lot of benefit for people that are more apprehensive when working with these technologies. So when one is more apprehensive and they start getting a relationship to the mushroom or to the plant or to whatever it is you're consuming before diving in deep, it can kind of like help. So it's often those people are like they microdose for a little bit and they're like, what? I've not felt anything. Really? I should go up a little bit. And then they have a mini dose and then they start like kind of feeding their curiosity through that. So I think that can be beneficial. But like honestly, there's so little that is fully known because there's not really been solid microdosing studies. There's just been a lot of anecdotal, like there's a lot of surveys, right? There's a lot of surveys. And of course, when somebody is a microdoser and they're working on a scientific survey that kind of wants to tell people how good microdosing is, they might be a little biased, like we saw with the MDMA studies. I don't know how much you followed that with MAPS, that the people that were on that end also wanted this to be like legalized and available to the masses, and therefore they had like some bias to their actual efficacy claims. So I think it depends. That's like the best thing. It depends if it's right for you. But I think a regimen of a certain time is probably a lot better than just taking it as a kind of a supplement. Like, oh, I have a pill. Like, I take a multivitamin, I take my magnesium, I take my cordyceps, and then I add my microdose to that. I think when approached with that perspective, it might not be as effective.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that. Is that something you can elaborate on, the MDMA study with MAPS? I mean, because I mean, just in general, that seems like such an important thing. I mean, I think maybe more people are realizing that obviously it's very difficult for science to be unbiased. I mean, I think that's one of the big things that happened in the pandemia is maybe some people woke up to that science just de facto is not unbiased. I mean, it potentially can be. I mean, you could even argue it can never truly be because it's always being done by a human who has their own biases. But as best you can try and kind of accept those into the studies. But yeah, I'd be curious about that. I hadn't heard anything with those studies.
Yeah, there's a really good podcast series, which is not for the faint of heart, called I think the first episode is called "I See a Shit Show," and the podcast might be called "Power Trip." And it's kind of in the whole podcast series is about the things that nobody wants to talk about, which was happening within the psychedelic scene. So they featured the MAPS program and some of the sexual misconduct that happened there, and also they interviewed some of these participants that also obviously are big fans of the medicine of MDMA, and then they did not really feel supported and seen by the actual like protocol of the study, but then they found it really hard to give negative feedback because they wanted this to be available and they know they were participating in a scientific study. And then the podcast also goes into some of the fake curanderos in the Amazon. People just claim to be that and then use that as a power position to like abuse some of the women that come visit them and like are looking for healing. So it's an interesting like listen from a perspective of, there's so much positive within our circles about psychedelics and sacraments and all of that stuff. And I think it's healthy to hear some of the things that are not great about the scene. So that's kind of the thing with MAPS. And I think also that's why the FDA decided to not go through with changing the schedule of MDMA is because, yeah, the studies were sloppy to that degree.
Yeah, I mean that brings up another kind of interesting topic. You were mentioning this a bit also, like with this idea that the politicians need to work with earth medicines or plant medicines. It was something I would often hear in the last kind of decade when Trump was in office. All of these people thought like he needed to work with it, and yet they couldn't see their own blinders that were staring them in the face as well. But even in indigenous systems that have a long tradition of working with these things, I mean, kind of shamanic traditions in general, like they're very dualistic. I mean, they view the world as a constant battle between light and dark, and often the role of the shaman is to eliminate darkness, to fight darkness, to bring order to darkness. And so there isn't this view that everything is light and rainbows and unicorns, which I think is often how this work can be portrayed. Or are there certain things that you found from your own experience or working in this field that maybe should be talked about, or things to be cautious over? Or, are mushrooms for everyone? Or are there certain people who shouldn't work with them? Or are there things to be mindful of the environment you're putting yourself into?
Yeah, well, a lot of yes to all of those. Some things that are coming up is, well, a reminder that a lot of the shamans, the people that work with ayahuasca in the jungle that are considered medicine people, they throw like spear darts. They have like spiritual warfare with other shamans, right? Like they try to like literally fuck and like curse people while they're on these substances. So that's part of that tradition as well. Just like with the Mexica, which are the people in Mexico that now are referred to as the Aztecs. They never called themselves the Aztecs. They were the Mexica. They loved consuming psilocybin mushrooms. And they would do it at a festival, like at big parties, and they would drink cacao and very slowly chew on these mushrooms. So kind of like what we're doing in kind of like these transformational festivals, right? There's music, there's cacao, there's mushrooms, very similar. Now you just have to imagine a big old pyramid in the center with the head of the party having an obsidian knife in their hand and like cutting out the heart of a live person and holding it up and offering it to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, and they would kick the body down, and then the people in the crowd be waiting to rip the arms off and consume that. Like that's how the Mexica did, right? Right now we're saying that the Mayas were less of the spiritual sacrifice and the Mexica were, but it seems to be pretty like in stone of all the writings of their neighbors that these people really like to eat mushrooms and ritually sacrifice people, which that's also reality. So within the scene, I think, there's certain people that are saying like psilocybin makes better people. And I think that's just straight up, that's just bullshit. Like I've met too many people that consume a lot of these mushrooms or ayahuasca that can just be complete dicks, like, and not nice people. And I like to refer to it as a psychedelic induced ego inflation. And I know because I've experienced that when I was 18. I didn't have a mentor. I had these connections to the divine and I thought I had all the answers. And I looked down a little bit on the people that didn't know these things, that hadn't like touched God or like been one with the universe or any of those things. So I do think that there's a ego inflation that can happen when working with these technologies. So when people bring up, oh, Trump should have mushrooms or like ayahuasca, I was like, I'm honestly thinking that he would just become a bigger narcissist. He would probably have some form of experience that just affirms all of his beliefs. And I don't know if that's beneficial. So, maybe not. Maybe that's not the case. But like, I do think that it's not for everybody. I recently met somebody that's really into mushrooms, and he's been into mushrooms for a long time, but he's never worked with psychedelics. And he's like, oh, I'm just kind of building up to that. But he seems to be like crushing life. He has like a family. He seems to be super happy, like great relationships with his partner, with his kids, with his friends, great career that he loves doing. I'm like, why would you need to do something that can radically change your course of your life right now? Maybe if you're really called, if you really think, oh my God, this needs to happen in my life. I feel like I'm missing something. But there's a saying like, don't stir the shit, right? If things are going really good in your life, maybe now the time for a completely transcendental, transformative, psychedelic experience in the jungle somewhere isn't the thing for you, because it can bring stuff up, right? Maybe you have some like deep like trauma, or like, which I also think happens in the psychedelic experience, but nobody talks about. We can tell ourselves that we have had certain experiences. Like I've told myself, like I fully went to an extent, what's it called again, psychotic, because I thought like I had these memories that I didn't really have. It took me like grounding and integration. It's like, oh, I just dug up, I just manifested some things. Maybe I just needed to live that form of experience, but it took me as somebody that was experienced to realize that. But if you are new to it and you have that experience and you create a memory that might not be there, and that steers your life off in a different direction, which can also be possible, right? I don't know. Like, for obviously, I love these sacraments, right? I love mushrooms. I love all of the sacred earth medicines. They've given me so much, and they continue to be, like, for me, invaluable teachers. And yeah, I've seen them also cause harm, because that's working with a knife, right? It's a tool. You can cut your vegetables, you can cut your foods, you can make the best foods, or you can cut your thumb off, or your like tip of your finger if you're just being reckless, or you're using the wrong knife, the wrong tool for the wrong moment, right? So that's kind of my 2 cents to it all. I think they can be great, and I think they can be dangerous, like anything in life, cars, bicycles, anything, mobile phones.
I think that's an important point. I mean, I think as a lot of people are kind of rediscovering these things, we do tend to like evangelize, or kind of this idea that I was talking about, which really is the root of the mind virus, which is this idea of separation. And it was very wisely said by this guy named Jeronimo Masarasa. He works for ICEERS, and he said when the Europeans came to the Amazon, they looked at the indigenous people and they said they're too indigenous. They need to be more Western. And he said it really, the mentality hasn't changed, because now you have kind of Europeans who go to the Amazon and they see an indigenous person wearing a t-shirt and they're like, oh my God, they become so Western. They need to be more indigenous. And it's the same thing. And we tend to, I think we went from a culture where we said indigeneity is quite bad, to also looking at indigeneity and saying it's full of grace and beauty and connection. And as you said, I mean, you can argue the ritual sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of people is a good thing. Like, you can argue that, but then you also have to justify that. And I think most people would argue that that's not a bad thing. And again, all of these plants or substances have their good and bad, their light and dark. One thing I wanted to ask you before we begin to wrap up is, and I think it's an important point, which you mentioned in the beginning, was this terminology of psilocybin and how you, because usually when we refer to working with magic mushrooms or psychedelic mushrooms, inevitably people start to think of psilocybin. So what's kind of the deeper nuance to not only the etymology, but actually what's happening with that?
Yeah. So again, it comes from moving away from a term that's stigmatic, right? So the common term for them, like since the 50s, 60s, was just magic mushrooms. And then somehow that became stigma, and then people started referring to them as shrooms. And then there's some people within the scene that just have something against those terminologies. And I think it's really good when speaking to legislators and people that don't know, and they just want to see the science and the benefit to potential society, all that stuff. I think it's good to use technical terms like psilocybin. But the thing, the wrong bit about that is that psilocybin isn't psychedelically active, right? It's a so-called prodrug, so it needs to be dephosphorylated, I think is the word. So there's an extra phosphor on psilocybin, which protects the molecule and makes it more stable. So the psilocin isn't stable at all. Psilocybin is very stable. And that's because that layer of phosphor that kind of protects it. And that gets taken away in our body. And then the psilocin goes into our blood, and that goes into our, like, past our blood-brain barrier and attaches to the 5-HT2A receptor. So psilocybin, not even psychedelically active. Psilocin is. But then also, where I came up, I was at a mushroom conference / festival this weekend, and I came up with an analogy that a lot of people find benefit in. A lot of people like drinking cocktails, right? I don't know, you strike me as a person that might not touch any alcohol, but maybe once in your life. Did you ever have a favorite cocktail, Jason?
Well, I actually used to work as a bartender, so
Okay.
I've had my fair share of drinks. Yeah,
Fantastic.
I still drink. I enjoy whiskey very much. Yeah.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So what do you still have a favorite cocktail?
I don't like cocktails in general.
Okay.
I think because I bartended so much and I
Okay.
use so much simple syrup in making all these
Okay.
cocktails that it just feels kind of gross. But we'll go with dark and stormy. I would still drink it dark and
Stormy.
stormy.
Sweet. That like the root, like that's a whiskey based, right?
It's been a long time. I think it's rum, but
I don't know.
we can call it whiskey. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like, okay, dark and stormy if you love them versus just having pure shitty rum. It's not the same. What if I just like take all of the nuance and the flavors of the rum or the whiskey for you as a whiskey lover away and just straight up ethanol? Just give you straight ethanol. Here, drink that. That's not gonna give you the same amount of pleasure. It's not the whole experience, right? So we're reducing these organisms. They're like conscious, like living organisms, and we're reducing them to one single molecule when we call them psilocybin mushrooms. And I think it's just derogatory, and I don't think it does it justice. And recently, very recently, I think it's 2 months ago, a paper came out that showcased that within mice, there was more of the neurogenetic outputs that like we're hoping to see from giving humans and animals and whoever wants it these organisms from a hot water extract of these mushrooms, also known as a tea, like a tea, mushroom tea, versus the synthesized psilocybin. So they're a chemical cocktail of these alkaloids, including baeocystin, including norpsilocin, norbaeocystin, all these different things that we probably don't know anything about. And I do think like the cocktail is meant to be consumed in its entirety. And most people do that, right? No, but like synthesized psilocybin is really, really expensive. Extracted psilocybin, that is pure psilocybin, is also really difficult because like separating like the baeocystin and all that stuff. Basically, nobody is doing that. And if you're listening to that and you're doing that, please reach out because I'm interested. So I think it's just like reducing these sentient organisms that we are building a relationship with, that we are walking in a symbiotic path with, to a molecule. It's just, I don't think that's the right way. So I like to say we're working with organisms, not molecules. Stop calling them psilocybin mushrooms. Some alternatives are magic mushrooms. Great. If you want to be accurate, psilocybe mushrooms, right? Then you're scientific. Then you're calling the beast as it is, right? Like calling us, we're all a bunch of homos, which is true. We're all homo sapiens, right? That's who we are as humans. And that's what they are. They're the psilocybes. We like to call them with Fungi Academy, we call them sacred mushrooms, just as a link to the Mazatec and other like Mesoamerican wisdom keepers that would call them hongros sagrados, like, or los niños santos, the holy children, which translates a little different, right? So sacred mushrooms, any of those traditional names as well. And whatever it is that you feel like can come up that gives reference, that is not just that molecule, which sounds cool, right? If we say it like, oh, look how I know how to say difficult words, psilocybin. I think that's part of why we like it as well. It's a cool word to say. But I do think that it's losing some of, I don't think I can actually change the lingo with this. I just like to bring it to awareness. I also say psilocybin mushrooms sometimes just because everybody says it. I was just at this conference and like in the UK, almost everybody says it. And then like suddenly in the conversation, I even started saying it. So it's hard to get out of what is the whole community is saying to an extent. But I think it is at least worthwhile to bring to awareness that there's maybe perhaps better names to call these amazing organisms.
Yeah, great. Also, in the beginning, you mentioned lichens, and I think
Oh,
that's something that people aren't so familiar with. How does that fit into this kind of plant fungi kingdom? I was speaking to a guy. I had been living in the Sacred Valley of Peru, and he was saying, and I don't know how much truth there is, but that essentially there's all of these undiscovered alkaloids, and really like new antibiotics are being discovered working with lichens. And lichens are something, if nothing else, just visually, that have always really struck me. I mean, I learned what usnea was a long time
hmm
ago, and just, the amazing kind of antimicrobial, antibacterial, heals wounds. If you're ever just out walking, it's an amazing plant. But to me, there's something magical about lichens, and almost very otherworldly too. I mean, even usually it's also a sign of like the almost like the pristineness of the environment. Like, you
hmm
find them when there's something very like kind of pure air, like quite untouched from man even.
Yeah, so they are. They're not plants, right? They are the essence of a symbiotic organism. They are ecosystems. That's what they are. They are microscopic ecosystems that we can see because the corpus, the body, is macroscopic. And the body is mainly composed of a fungus, right? So we dictate the species because the fungus kind of creates a beautiful greenhouse for these cyanobacteria or these algae. And the algae or cyanobacteria, they can live fine without the fungus, but the fungus cannot live without the cyanobacteria or the algae, right? So it creates a beautiful house, this beautiful greenhouse. These plants come, these the microorganismic photobionts, and they start photosynthesizing. So the fungi eats the sugars that this like cyanobacteria or algae produces, and the fungi in turn gives it nitrogen, phosphorus, mainly nitrogen that actually helps the plant do photosynthesis. So I think that's really like beautiful. The whole word symbiosis was coined by Heinrich Anton de Barry in the 1800s, I think 1885, when he was studying lichen. That's really when he was like, damn, people, like not people, but organisms can actually work together and not only fight each other. That was the traditional like way of looking at the world, at least Renaissance, like late stage Renaissance way of looking at the world. Everything is fighting each other. But then Heinrich Anton de Barry found out that they were working together. And then recently, relatively recently, people found out there was a yeast present that is intricate to that symbiosis. So there's actually three kinds of organisms that are working together. And then, like I said earlier, when I talked about the centaurea lichen, there's also endodicanic fungi and bacteria that live within a phase called the medulla, which is very thin, but like there's a lot of craziness going on over there. Lichen are ancient. They are at least 450 million years old, probably older. Some people saying 600. They don't fossilize well. They're just probably very, 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 very old because it's such an effective way. 80% of the Earth's landmass is covered in lichen. And most people, like if you ask a random person, they can't even point you at one, right? So they are indeed, like you said, Jason, they are a indicator of good air quality. So you don't see them in heavily polluted areas. Some of them you do, but like most of them, like when it's really vibrant and they're really abundant and they're everywhere, you see them only in like very, very healthy ecosystems. So there's not much we know uh, because they're just, often overlooked. Of course, there's lichenologists and there's a lot of studies going on, but there's like a whole, like they are as good at producing these alkaloids, if not better than mushrooms are, right? So people are dying with lichen, so you can actually create pigments, but you can also have medicinal properties that are being produced. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to see. You talk about usnea, and people use usnea for like for lots of different applications. Generally, also for like ease of breath and uh, like lung activity. And because they are so small, we don't have as much relationship, and there's not as many indigenous peoples that work with lichens, right? So famously, up in Siberia, you have reindeer lichen because reindeer eat it, and they figure, oh, they eat it, we eat it too. There's a lot of oxalic acid in there, so you have to kind of cook it so you don't create stomach pains. It's also called reindeer moss, by the way. So it's not a moss, it's a lichen. It's very confusing for a lot of people. In Dutch, we actually call them korstmos, which is very closely related to the word cosmos, but it also just means crusty moss. So that's a fun little tidbit about lichen. But there's even a lichen that produces psilocybin and psilocin. Did you know that? It grows in the Amazon. It's Dictyonomia uareae. It was described by Wade Davies. And who I think I don't want to butcher the name of these people. Who HUO something like this. They're a relatively large group of tribes in the Amazon, but they actually consume it according to Wade Davis. So there's some psychedelic lichen out there as well that I think we have yet to discover, because they're not as charismatic as mushrooms. They're not as big. If you're not really desperate for food, you probably are not going to eat a lichen. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. One other thing I wanted to ask you, I was listening to maybe one of your talks, and you mentioned an idea with mushrooms of niacin. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I can't remember the exact context of that.
So it was about the stack, right? The stack that Mrs. Stamets, that Paul had coined and now patented, that's consuming lion's mane with a psilocybin microdose, as he calls it. So psilocybe cubensis generally, or like any other psilocybe mushroom. And then he adds niacin, which, have you ever tried this stack?
I haven't. I mean, I just know niacin as it's often used as a heart condition remedy, but it's also interesting because I work with tobacco, and tobacco contains a lot of niacin, and tobacco is often used as in a more indigenous way as the plant that opens up other plants. So I often find it interesting when kind of in a scientific way, they're saying that there's some correlation between kind of niacin opening maybe to a deeper level, some other plant or fungi in this case.
Yeah. So I think niacin is what we call a vitamin. Wait, I want to get this right. What is it? B3? Yes, B3. So you find it in a lot of things. You can take it as a supplement, and it's an opener, right? So it's a vasodilator. So Paul's idea, is that then you take the stack of the lion's mane and the psilocybe mushroom, and then because you add a big dose of niacin, all your veins dilate, including the ones in your brain, and you just have more, like what he calls, like more effective than neurogenesis. I find it very overwhelming. The dose he recommends, it's really a lot. There's actually a fun anecdote at Fungi Academy HQ. We have an HQ in Guatemala that we do our courses at, and we do retreats and stuff like this. And he somebody saw white powder, which was niacin, and they just wrote baking powder on it. And this girl baked bread for everybody, and then everybody got these red flushes and rashes and started feeling very hot. So that's what you said. They thought the flour had gone bad, or that they all had this weird allergic reaction. I was like, oh, you guys just added niacin to the bread. So that's kind of the reaction. But there's mushrooms that have niacin as well. I think tobacco is actually very good. If you work with tobacco and you have a healthy relationship with it, either through hape or whatever a method you work with tobacco with, I think that could work really well. Turkey tail has quite a bit of niacin, B3. So, this is all hypothetical as well, right? Like consuming the niacin to have more efficacy of the other mushrooms you're taking is the idea, but people really like listening to Paul. So I think a lot of people are attached to that stack specifically. And I think there's some alternatives if you don't vibe with just the straight up niacin supplements.
Well, amazing, Jasper. We're over 2 hours. Is there anything you want to talk about that we didn't touch on? Anything that comes to mind?
We covered a lot, Jason. It was great. I feel like we could keep going or do another one. I feel like we've been researching a lot of the same things and look at a lot of these challenging and pretty wide ranging topics from a similar lens. So it's always nice to meet kindred spirits. Hey, we have some things coming up at Fungi Academy. I don't know when this is airing, but we have some spots left for our cultivation courses. So they're like retreats And so you get like food and accommodation included. We teach the whole mushroom cultivation process, but we do saunas and cold plunges and like do some mycology. We like go hang out with Mayan mushroom farmers and Mayan mushroom foragers and stuff like this. So it's like it's a whole experience. And then we have the human mycelium retreats, which is a thing that we didn't really touch base on, but the idea of looking at how fungi function within ecosystems and finding kind of lessons for our own human mycelial network, right? Like how fungi spread nutrients and like are the interconnectors and kind of the conductors to the orchestra of life within an ecosystem, and how we can emulate certain ways that fungi show up in the natural world in our own lives to kind of create these fruitful conditions for us to thrive in and for our community to thrive in. So that's done with like authentic relating and nonviolent communication practices, leadership skills, like how to build community around you. Like you love mushrooms, there's not anybody around you that loves mushrooms. How do you kind of get that movement going? So we go into that and lots of other things. And of course, we work a little bit with the sacred mushroom as well. So that's coming up in November. And you can always just shoot us an email if you have questions, or you also have any questions for me. Just connect at Fungi Academy or Fungi Academy everywhere on the internet. Will be pretty easy to find. So yeah, that's what's coming up.
So Fungi Academy is the website and the Instagram tag and all of that.
YouTube, Instagram, websites, everything.
Okay, great. Well, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Well, hey man, thank you so much, Jasper. Actually, we mentioned this in the last time we tried shooting, which didn't pan out. But you were recommended to me by a guy who's become a good friend. His name is Jeff Chilton, and his son, also Sky. They have a really good company, and they actually sponsor the podcast. So he's never recommended anyone to me. So when he recommended you, I knew he has very good taste. I consider him kind of a kindred spirit too, and likewise, man. Yeah. I really enjoyed this conversation, and like you were saying, I think we could talk easy for another 2 hours. So I really appreciate what you're doing, your work, and I'd love to do round 2 sometime. This will probably come out in like a month, 6 weeks, but we'll connect then. And I just, again, I really appreciate you, the way you share and kind of your mind and how you're thinking about these things. I think it's really beautiful. So thank you very much for your time.
Likewise, Jason. It's been a pleasure. And thank you so much for having me on.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jasper. I think he's a fascinating guy. I personally really enjoy talking to him, getting to pick his mind a bit. And I think we have a lot of similar interests and worldviews. So it was a really interesting conversation for me, and I hope for all of you as well. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good option. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for, and also those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all the people supporting that way, thank you very much for your help. And if you're able to, thank you in advance. It's really what allows me to continue making these episodes. If you're not able to do that, just helping with the algorithms is a big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. When this comes out, it'll probably be after our November plant dieta in the Sacred Valley of Peru, but we're actually already sold out for that one. We have another one coming up in February in the Sacred Valley of Peru. At the time of this recording, we still have spaces available for that, and we're just going to begin opening up for our Portugal retreat, which will be in the end of April into the beginning of May. So you'll be able to find more information about that on my website, nicotianarustica.org. So if you're interested in working with plants and the process of dieta, learning more experientially from plants, that's a really wonderful opportunity. My next guest, I'm not sure, this is actually the last of a series of episodes I'm shooting kind of far in advance before I go into dieta. But as always, I hope to continue to bring on really fascinating guests. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope this finds you all well, and I will see you all on the next episode.